And I too will try to be cognizant of time and not read all of the passages that I'm citing, but rather leave them up here. Miha, netwanyane Wallace Cleaves. Hello, my name is Wallace Cleaves. Awesh koneha ekwa aha tovangar. Thank you so much for having me here today, and I bring you greetings from Tovangar, which is the Tongva world, the Los Angeles region, and I will speak on that in a little bit. I have a somewhat traditional academic paper, but I will interleaven it with a bit of personal and ancestral discourse as well. From the opening passages of Beowulf to the romances of Arthur, Horn, and Havelok, medieval literature in English betrays an obsession with and an anxiety over origins, lineage, and heredity. This focus is particularly intense in literature representative of periods of cultural and linguistic turmoil and transition, and even more apparent in literature that deals with the threat of invasion, colonization, and cultural appropriation. These concerns are also often exacerbated by the internally acknowledged brittleness of written records and informed by a reliance on orality and ritual memorialization. A deep concern for the fragility of memory and the attendant danger that rupture and forgetting inherent both in familial and political dynasties informs many of the central works of the medieval English tradition. A comparable anxiety over ruptured lineage is still profoundly apparent among many indigenous populations, particularly those encompassed by significant colonial cultures. Emblematic of these tensions are the debates over authenticity and legitimacy of heritage that inform tribal politics and policy of many Northern American, Native American nations. These concerns appear both in the burgeoning literature produced over the last century by Indigenous, First Nations, and Native American authors, in the historical record of these communities, and in the actual political and cultural practice of contemporary tribes. I seek to understand how these two very different cultures and literatures may, through comparative analysis, inform each other, and how critical and analytical methodologies applied to the study of these fields may be productively deployed across their respective boundaries. To explore the ways that lineage is and fails to be memorialized, particularly at moments of historical rupture and disjuncture. Specifically, I will examine the way medieval literary traditions, which often similarly bridged the gap between pre- and post-literate environment, may be able to illuminate the way Native American communities have dealt with the preservation and commemoration of heritage across similar boundaries. Lineage matters. It matters biologically, culturally, politically, socially, and in so many ways and so many and varied ways that it is nearly futile to attempt to articulate many forms in which it is central to identity. Yet, as much as it matters, still, it mattered and still matters even more in conditions where it is paradoxically uncertain, but also essential. Despite its seeming importance, memory of lineage is actually quite transitory. It is an oft-touted truism of genealogical research that, quote, this is from Aaron Helt of the National Archives, it only takes 3 generations to lose a piece of oral family history. It must be purposely and accurately repeated over and over again through the generations to be preserved for a genealogist today. In effect, this means that great-grandchildren are not likely to have any significant or meaningful memories of their great-grandparents, with a few long-lived exceptions. But more than the personal memories of individuals, it is the oral history of families and lineages that is lost with great rapidity amongst the descendants. This trend was accelerated in the 20th century in many Western countries. Intergenerational families became less common, reaching a low of 12% in households by 1980, a trend which has reversed somewhat in the new millennium, climbing back to near 20% according to a critical recent Pew poll. For many individuals, lineage is both critically important in the near term, with a host of studies showing that a wide variety of critical factors from income to education to likelihood of becoming a teenage mother directly mirror parental statistics. And surprisingly transient, even 2 generations out. According to an extensive Ancestry.com survey, and I know all the problems with it, but they do have the data, half of Americans know the name of only one or none of their great-grandparents. 1/3 cannot name any great-grandparents, and only 40% know both their grandmothers' maiden names. These are modern, but still perhaps useful indicators of the relative transience of ancestral memory. And I also have this little stat up here because a recent survey, or a little bit more recent survey, shows that it's even getting worse. But of course, there are families, groups, and entire cultures that significantly privilege such genealogical information. Yet even, or perhaps especially among those who privilege the importance of lineage, there's a great anxiety over the veracity and reliability of ancestral pedigree. Two seemingly disparate environments, that of the medieval period and that of the contemporary Native American culture in the United States, share a curious proximity in the nature of their dependence upon and uncertainty about lineage. I'll start with the medieval, and I'll start with Beowulf. Lineage is important, central even, in the earliest extant texts in the English literary tradition. Beowulf itself begins with an account of the lineage of Hrothgar, going back, oh yeah, it did come up, through Halfdan, Beowulf, and Helshefson, a name that includes yet another patronymic. Beowulf is introduced in the poem by an act of double hereditary invocation, identifying both himself through his paternal lineage and his relationship with Hrothgar through Halfdan. The critical importance of paternal lineage is highlighted in this essential passage. Both Beowulf and Hrothgar's names are elided in this initial moment. Hrothgar mentioned in 279, and Beowulf only revealing his own name in line 343. Genealogically and textually, these two central figures are preceded by their fathers, the identification of which serves to validate both Beowulf's own assertion of his right to offer aid and counsel and Hrothgar's worthiness to receive it. Of course, there is another critical lineage mentioned in the work, that of Grendel, whose descent from Cain is critical to his initial characterization. The Christian overlay of Grendel's heritage is a superb improvisation recognizing the poem's critical obsession with inheritance, both good and ill. Here, inheritance is quite literally a curse. A whole alternative lineage of the monstrous is provided, echoing Hrothgar's own pedigree in inverted form. In a wonderful double inversion, Grendel's heritage is also essential to establishing his credentials as a monster. But it is eventually his maternal rather than paternal ancestor whom he is indebted to for his fearsomeness and who takes up his mantle, avenging him and eclipsing him in prowess and threat. Perhaps even more intriguing in this passage and in the subsequent depiction of Grendel's mother is the hint of an alternative sort of lineage, one that significantly predates even the farthest ancestors for Hrothgar's line. His is an ancestral line intentionally forgotten, only hinted at and purposefully not remembered, relegated to the outer darkness and banned from association with the likes of the Danes, upon whom he preys. As such, it should come as no surprise then that Grendel has been embraced repeatedly as a sort of stand-in for the mostly elided and forgotten indigenous precursors effaced in so much of Western European literature, perhaps particularly in English. In several filmic versions, such as Sturla Gunnarsson's 2005 Canadian-Icelandic Beowulf and Grendel, which figures the monster as an at least nominally sympathetic indigenous Neanderthal-esque holdover being oppressed by colonizing Danes. Indeed, this particular sort of reading of the figure of Grendel has gained increased prominence among medievalists recently, as a result, in part, of my friend Adam Miyashiro's article from In the Medieval Middle, quote, long title here, Decolonizing Anglo-Saxon Studies, a response to ISAS in Honolulu in July of 2017, which addressed the lack of representation at the conference of the International Society of Anglo-Saxonists, which took place in Honolulu, Hawaii in 2017. Miyashiro specifically noted that his own proposed paper, which considered Grendel as an indigenous person with a specific biopolitics and linked a non-European reading of Beowulf to the contemporary issues of white supremacy that plagues what was then Anglo-Saxon studies, and medieval studies more broadly, was not accepted, nor were those of other scholars whose works appeared to challenge a more staid interpretation of what Anglo-Saxon studies should entail, despite the nominal theme of the conference. It might be worth pausing here to consider the importance of such alternative readings of the texts, even if it is impossible to establish an intentional, historically informed reading of Grendel as a realized other within the confines of the text. Simply the presence of an outside figure whose very heredity marks him as apart shows a conscious awareness in the literature of the Anglo-Saxon period of the critical importance of otherness and the role of lineage and ancestry, and also perhaps of memory, or at least its absence, in determining such a status. This is no small matter in contemporary medieval studies, as the field deals with the strange appropriation of medieval tropes by alt-right groups and internal debacles such as the much remarked upon tone deafness of the 2017 Leeds Conference on Otherness in Medieval Literature and current attempts to diversify the field. In fact, the othering of Grendel mirrors quite a number of the characteristics of how many indigenous groups, including Native Americans, have consistently been othered and continue to be in political, social, and popular culture. Grendel's othering occurs precisely because he is otherworldly, even alien, by virtue of his hereditary lineage, which differentiates him so much that he becomes essentially inhuman, particularly by dint of his supernatural origins. This is actually a common feature of othering of indigenous groups. Virginia McLaren points out how this process works in the case of Native Americans, particularly in reference to their portrayal in cinematic culture. And I just love this line. I won't read the whole of it, but that great line at the end. And I always think about people always ask that question, well, how Native are you? Trying to get like, well, how much heredity do you actually have? To which the response has to always be so Native. Oh, just so much Native. And I see this here. They are so native, so in touch with nature and the universe, that many of them are like mystical shamans. They know about extraterrestrial aliens, they can shapeshift, or they can see things non-natives cannot see. Here is a fairly plain case of the regionally based stereotype that exotifies and others. In the case of native indigenous populations, as with Grendel, otherness critically makes accommodation impossible, and the only means of possible interaction is at best segregation and is at worst genocide. While Grendel's othering is far more dire, it is of a similar kind. He is further dehumanized by descriptive language, fashioned as a feond on hele, where sagrima gest Grendel heten, that complicates his essential humanity. For the others and the monsters, lineage is just as critical as it is for the heroes. Pardon me. Displacing them from humanity and making them impossible to incorporate or cohabit with. In essence, ancestry is here racialized and weaponized, creating a difference so profound that the other is not only no longer recognizably human, but a supernatural creature. Though extreme in this example, the realization of lineage is a feature noted elsewhere in medieval literature, even a feature of it as a result of specific and well-documented social forces only hinted at in Beowulf. Reconstructing lineage. Ancestry became increasingly important in the medieval period, transformationally so sometime, around the first millennium, as heredity became the critical differentiating sign that entailed access to political and social power. Howard Block notes in Etymologies and Genealogies the centrality of this shift in the medieval period in Western literature. The two ways that he mentions here were the shrinking of the kinship group and the marked, quote, preference for consanguineal over affinal kin. And I just realized I don't think I've ever said those actual words out loud. In this case, not only did ancestral ties become the defining feature of political power, the very concept of what ancestry meant was likewise shaped by the social and political forces it enabled. This oddly reciprocal and even tautological relationship is also noted by Patrick Geary in his work Phantoms of Remembrance, in a manner that both complicates and explains the sort of narratives that are emblematic of the subsequent genres of national epic and romance. In the rest of the medieval period, Geary argues that a critical part of his process was a sense of the rupture from the past, a disassociation from prior forms of social and political organization that preceded the chivalric era. Do I have Geary there? Yes, I do. The dislocation from the past and an attendant forgetting of it, or at least of specific portions of it, precisely enabled the construction of the new forms of political and familial structure. Yet somewhat perversely, the rupture of tradition also made critical the single stable signifier of order and continuity, ancestral heritage. Geary also notes that along with the rupture of memory that he argues occurs around the millennium, there is also a critical sense of continuity conveyed by the associational linkage to prior and inheritable familial power stemming from that lost past. And that's the second quote up there. Curiously, the increased role of hereditary lineage is a product of simultaneous forgetting and perseverance. It requires both rupture and continuity in measure. It is a concept perhaps best encapsulated by the term anamnesis, with its origins in Platonic philosophy, indicating a recall of the past, even past existence, that provides profound insight. But at the core of the concept of anamnesis is the recognition of the impossibility, or at least implausibility, of that recall. It should be no great surprise that that which is most fragile and ephemeral is also the most valuable. And so ancestry becomes critically important at the moment of greatest rupture. This seeming paradox is critical in understanding the role and depiction of heritage in the critical works of medieval literature on the continent, but perhaps even more interesting to consider in relation to the matter of Britain, and specifically the Arthurian material within that body, a corpus at least partially obsessed with familial and cultural continuity and rupture in equal measure. Arthur and ancestry. An anxiety about ancestry is profoundly present in the matter of Arthur, arguably the most essential medieval English character and story. Geoffrey of Monmouth's early 12th century Historia Regum Britanniae, the originary touchstone for much of the development of the Arthurian tradition in English, dwells on the curious generation of Arthur through Uther's act of assuming Gorlois' form by means of Merlin's magic and his subsequent deception of Igraine and the conception of Arthur. That Arthur is himself engendered by, and that's the first quote there, by an act that cannot help but call into question his lineage and paternity is certainly critical to the development of the Arthurian matter and points to a deep anxiety over the central notion of inherited position. The problematic nature of Arthur's conception is glossed over textually by an account of Uther's regret and the subsequent success of his match with Igraine. That's the next quote. Yet this passage is most notable in what it almost seems to imply, through a lack of clear, boy, did I qualify that, through a lack of clear timeline. No astute reader concerned with lineage and the heritability of noble titles could help but wonder if this strange tale somehow conceals a critical lapse in the ancestry of the eponymous kings of Britain. It is essentially impossible not to wonder if the strange tale of Arthur's generation conceals more than Uther's form, but rather Arthur's true lineage. Is he the true son of Uther, or is he the fosterling of the king? The previous narrative makes it textually clear that Arthur is Uther's son, but the very existence of the tale of his strange conception cannot help but make it clear, make that claim tenuous and troubled. And I think I'm going to have to skip ahead here. Yes, I am. I definitely am. Boy, I thought I had that time right, and I did not. One feature of the theory that is critical to understanding, am I right here? Yeah, I think so. Concept of, is critical to understanding the appeal and longevity of such material that recounts past wrongs is what Emma Gross notes in her study, The Effects of Recalled Historical Trauma on the Communities That Have Suffered It. It generates both self-destructive behavior and resilience in kind. Cultural trauma is powerful and always present and influential even after generations. Even more critically, Gross notes that the foundational ancestral and familial quality of such narratives, stories of past wrongs, are only meaningful if they are transmitted and passed on to those for whom they too have a meaning. Oh, and I do realize I overskipped. I apologize for this. My point here that I was trying to make is that the Arthurian material then delves into the genocidal conflict between the encroaching Anglo-Saxons and upon the Romano-Britons. Native American history is also a story about the will to survive long-term oppression in the name of cultural preservation. The Indian family is at the core of the Native American cultural restoration because children are viewed as sacred, the means by which Native American identity will both be revived and perpetuated. In this way, every resistance narrative and account of cultural trauma is both communal and personal, micro and macro. And I skipped so much, I apologize, because I felt like I have to do this other part or I just won't be being right here. So when we talk about cultural trauma and the history and the problems with understanding generations and the fragility of memory, the only way I can really speak to that is to talk about my own family experience. I'm extremely fortunate and want to share with you here something that I'm incredibly lucky to be able to do. I can actually share with you the voice of my great-great-great-grandmother, 6 generations from me, with my daughter 7 generations removed. And this is her singing. Hopefully it works. Please work. Oh no, it worked when we practiced it this morning. Heartbreaking. Can't get it to do it. Oh, I'm so sorry. Nope. Okay. I'll have to move on. Narcissa, I'm very fortunate in that she is one of the most documented Tongva women. This was mostly because an anthropologist who was fascinated in birds, wanted to be an ornithologist, wanted to record all the bird knowledge that she and others had. But because of his work, we have a huge amount of the Tongva, and the work of other anthropologists and informants, we have a significant amount of the Tongva language. And in fact, Narcissa, my ancestor, was the one who recorded the endonym Tongva, which we now use along with Gabrieleno, the colonial name that many of our elders still wish to use since that was what they've known themselves as. Again, I'm incredibly fortunate in this knowledge of my own ancestry, but this is something that's incredibly difficult for a huge number of Native American families. Because of boarding school experiences, because of suppression of culture, because in California particularly, and I'm going to have to skip again. Oh, okay, it's not working at all. The California genocide, which had 5 waves: the original mission period, the Spanish colonization, Mexican colonization, then Bear Flag Republic, and then finally US colonization, which was the most devastating of all, killing in a period of about 40 years almost 95% of the California Indian population in a period not far removed and which my ancestor Narcissa lived through. In that period of time, my ancestors survived actually having a price on their heads. This genocide in a form continues even in today, in that our community is still being dispersed because people can no longer afford to live within their ancestral homelands. The work that I do here academically is not nearly as important as the work that I do for my community. I'm honored to be the president of the Tongva Tarakat Pahava Conservancy, our land and culture conservancy, which has already begun to house tribal members who are housing insecure on our very first land back, which we acquired just this year. And this means more to me than anything else, and it is because of my academic work and the work of many others in our community and their academic experience that we were able to do this. I'm going to skip ahead again because I apologize. I feel like I really have the timing down on this wrong. I'm just going to skip to Paul Chatt-Smith and his comments on this. It is nowhere better recognized that we may, in what may be one of the more important exhibitions of Native American culture in recent times, the controversial but profound exhibit entitled Americans that was on display in the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian from 2018. This exhibit pulled together centuries of appropriation of Native imagery and symbolism containing everything from Indian motorcycles to painfully stereotyped sports team mascots to Tomahawk missiles. Yet its overwhelming message is acknowledgement of the centrality of the appropriated identity of Native Americans to the whole of the United States culture. As Paul Chatt-Smith, the curator of the exhibit, remarked on the phenomenon, he and his team noted and dubbed Indians everywhere. This opened up the paradox for us that most Americans know very little about Indians, yet from their earliest memories, Indians are part of their lives, and it never goes away. It's just that these aren't actual Indians. It's the idea of Indians, manifested in advertising and place names and cars and weapons and sport teams. The deeper we explored this, the more we found. Eventually, this became the rocket fuel that powers the entire exhibition. So the big idea, Indians everywhere, there is nothing like this anywhere else. Of course, I would argue that there is indeed something like this elsewhere, profoundly in the matter of Britain, the legend of Arthur, and in particular in a host of other critical appropriations that have occurred through the absorption of even the most counterintuitive and paradoxical representations of a colonized people. But as Smith also points out, there's a certain wonderful irony in this appropriative act. It turns out that the most American thing ever is in fact American Indians. How crazy is that? The Americans exhibition sees Indians everywhere as profound visual evidence that the country is acknowledging there is no United States without the indigenous. It's an emphatic, though subconscious, determination of the part of Americans to always remember it, no matter what. This kind of assumption of a culture is, of course, wildly problematic and requires all sorts of forgetting and elision of problematic details, even as it seeks to remember and reimagine that past. But Smith's argument is that it's also profound acknowledgement of the debt and the relevance of the culture being subsumed. It becomes impossible to imagine a United States without its Indians, just as it becomes impossible to imagine an England without Arthur and his Britons. What I'm essentially arguing here is that what is occurring in both the case of the matter of Britain and with Native Americans in the United States, and likely with other communities, though I don't want to speak to or for them, is that their cultural histories are being appropriated both on a cultural and personal level, and that both scholars of medieval literature and those of Native American and perhaps other indigenous cultures can recognize in each other's disciplines critical lessons. For the medievalists, the lesson is perhaps that the literature and the lessons of the past are still playing out and influencing critical cultural practices in ways and among communities where they might not initially be obvious, and that it is valuable to include the voices of others who speak from outside the established tradition, as they may have useful insights to potential interpretations grown opaque with time and distance. For scholars of Native American literature and culture, the lesson may be even more critical, that this has happened before, repeatedly, and that even appropriation, as problematic as it can often be, is not always an insult or a denigration. As Enrique Salmon attests in Resilience and Rebellious Memory Loops, further musings of an American Indian ethnoecologist, oral literature, ancestral narrative, song, story, all of these cultural practices that embody long and short-term memory are at the core of community resilience. They comprise the matter, substance, and the adhesive of human and cultural capital. The trick is that they can perform this role even for those who are adopting, a word that itself has a critical connotation of family bonding outside the normal bounds of hereditary links. That literature, those narratives, those songs and stories. Thank you very much. Awesh Koneha. And again, I'm sorry for the disjointure there, but I think it actually kind of fits. I did have one little thing that I wanted to ask you to do. I'm happy to take questions, but I did, because one of the things we were encouraged to do was to think of ways that we could help everybody kind of internalize these processes and the things that we're thinking of. So I'd like everybody to just take a second and do that very difficult work, and sometimes traumatic. So I understand, if you do not wish to, and many communities and cultures have different barriers to memory that are very painful. But to think back, who is the ancestor you can place the farthest back that you can? Think both in terms of your own memory, but also think in terms of the memory of your family, that oral history, and see how far you can go back. How many generations, and count that. Just take a second and think. And we can all do probably 1, 2, 3 generations. 4, 5, no, 6, we've got a few 6s, 7, a couple. And 8, right. And there's the loss. There's the gap that occurs. And so, again, this is one of the reasons we're near Haudenosaunee territory, the 7 generations, which is so intrinsic to that thought, and then has become part of larger Native American and Indigenous thought as well, that it takes 7 generations to recover from trauma, which is why the whole 8th generation movement exists. And, I see that with my own family. And so I think that speaks again to this experience. So internalize that and think about your own family connections and history there. Thank you for that, Awesh Koneha, and happy to take any questions. Oh, I don't know. Sure. Shoot, we even practiced it. There it is. It's this one.
So, thank you so much for that really powerful talk. Before I jump into my question, I just want to respond to what you said about how far can we trace back which side, how many generations. And I'm from the Dominican Republic. I know I'm descended from the Taino people who were native to the region, to enslaved Africans, and then to the Spanish colonizers. And the only one I can trace back that far is the European side, of course. So it speaks to that idea that you mentioned of disrupting the lineage. And on that line, I wanted to ask a little bit, you mentioned the beginning of Beowulf, how we have the lineage of the Schildings, Hrothgar descended from, Skilshefing, et cetera. Going back to Skilshefing being like, as far as he traces it back, the genealogy, and we don't know where Skilshefing came from, versus Grendel, who we don't get that lineage for, but we can go much further back to Cain.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, that kind of, is it a sort of conflicting genealogy or priority genealogy in which the outsider, Grendel, we have a much earlier origin for, as far as the lineage goes, but it's disrupted. Whereas with Hrothgar, we have a continuous line, but it ends much sooner.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think part of it, of course, is the fact that there's the kind of Christian overlay that there's so much evidence that comes in later, that the identification of Grendel with Cain is something that kind of occurs at a later point of the development of the work. But I think that it's really important that that's kind of put in there, because what I think it's doing is that it is, as you kind of pointed to, it's kind of dehumanizing, right? You kind of pointed out this. I think when we talk about this, it's like who gets disrupted, right? Who gets their lineage forgotten? It's the dispossessed, the othered, right? I'm in this really weird position that the ancestor I can go back to. I knew Vera, my great grandmother, who knew Narcissa Higuera. So I have this, Narcissa, Virginia, Vera, Thomas, my father, Wallace, and then me. I have that line. Actually, that's the clearest line I have in my family. That's unbelievable, because most of the time that's where the disruption happens. But, and that's exactly the kind of point that I'm trying to get to, for those communities, those disrupted communities, the lineage and the attempt to find some heritage. And I think this is why we see, even with families who have sort of a disrupted heritage, but they know of and can connect with, why it's so important to try to connect with that heritage, even if the exact ancestor is sometimes lost. And that anxiety that then causes, which causes all the problems around identity politics that kind of occur. And we can think of the issues with pretendians. And I should just disclose, UCR, of course, has probably the most internationally famous issue of identity fraud issue, which we're working to address. That is why it's so rife. I don't have an exact answer, but just that I think that problem, for those groups who are most dispossessed of their heritage becomes even more important. I hope that kind of gestures at an answer.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you for sharing that. Oh, you got it? Oh, yes, it looks different. Great. Oh, yes, you can hear her.
Song to an Infant by the Indian Mother, sung by Mrs. J.V. Rosemeyer.
And this is a wax cylinder from the Smithsonian, so it's very scratchy.
my soul, Sara, we sura pai so sai we so sa ami mayu my soul, Sara, ami mayu my soul, Sara, ami mayu my soul, Sara, we sura pai so sai we so sa ami mayu my soul, Sara, ami mayu.
And what I really love about that is that that's a song for the infant by the Indian mother, and you can see Narcissa there holding her grandchild, who I believe, I am not absolutely certain, is Virginia, who's behind her, so that might be Vera on her lap. So I've got 3 generations of the family right there, and there's the song that's being sung to the next generations, and it has come down to us over a century and a half, and that's a blessing I can't even explain. Thank you. Thank you so much for getting that to work. I appreciate it. I really wanted to share that with everybody. Thank you. I appreciate it. Any more questions? We still have time, a couple minutes.
I was struck by something you mentioned in passing about the child as a sacred figure in this sort of difficult to establish and maintain genealogy, which is in some cultures and largely in oral history. I just was interested to hear you sort of read that through some of the other texts that you introduced. It sort of seems like it's missing from the Grendel story, that figure of the child, although perhaps you'd see it otherwise. And then in the Arthurian texts, I guess we are sort of telling the story of the birth of a very important child. I just wondered where you see, and if you see, that figure elsewhere.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, and I would say with Grendel, that we do have, we have such a concrete sense of the importance of the child in what happens with Grendel's mother, who's of course unnamed afterwards. I think importantly, kind of not named, but that she goes on this rampage, which is far more terrifying than what Grendel did, and she is a far greater threat. In part because she's so much cleverer about what she does. Right? She doesn't kill the warriors. She kills. Think about who she kills. She kills the counselors. She kills the older, wiser folk. And she sets up, and because of their fall, that sets up the fall of the House of Hrothgar. So she destroys, I didn't have time to get into all this, but she destroys Hrothgar's lineage, I think. I mean, it's a little tenuous, I get that, but certainly we can see that the value of the valuing of the child, in the terror that she has, and there are some strangely sympathetic passages to her kind of anxiety over the loss of her child, and then I think that that you're exactly right too in kind of pointing out that in so many of these tales where, and we go kind of to the romance of origins, right? These kind of displaced children who have a disconnect with their family. I mean, Arthur, right? When Mallory, and I had to skip this too, Mallory, even further separates Arthur by having a fosterage that takes place that, disconnects him. We see, in Havelock, we see these sort of disconnects, these children who have to kind of reclaim a lost heritage. And we always have the question of, really, is that really your but of course that's the anxiety that's coming in there, and I think there's also something to be said in how that is so central in so many of these works that the child is displaced from the family. Right? That's actually something strange, and we think about like fosterage systems that occur in the medieval period, and even how they continued into the the impact. I've heard somebody say, all you have to do to understand colonialism is look at the English boarding school system, and that just explains this kind of, or it doesn't explain, but it at least points to sort of this desensitization of the family. And I don't know if that fully answers it, but at least hopefully starts to think about that.
Thank you.
That question.
Hi, thank you very much for your words. I come from the Mohawk community, and I'm always interested in the tension between recording something, not recording like that, but writing something down, and oral history, because oral history seems so fragile in the face of writing, especially as the Academy treats it. And I remember when I was, and I've talked to some people about this before, when I was a kid, you know, having this junior anthropologist moment, I thought, I'm going to interview and tape my grandma, my Duda, on the reservation. And she said, you know, what do you want to tape? And I said, well, family stories. And she said, no, I don't want you to do that. And it wasn't any mystified, you're going to steal my soul or something. It was, she said, if you think you can contain them outside of yourself, then they're not part of you. If they're on a shelf that you reach for, like, oh yeah, I think I have that somewhere, that's not knowledge you bear. And you can't rightfully pass it along as our knowledge of our family. And it was like a thunderbolt, you know, like, oh wow, like this has deep sense to it. And in a sense that I have to decide what I want to record in writing and what I want to live and contain and pass on generationally within my family or within my circle. And I think that I still find no place for that in the Academy, as though one is official knowledge and one is not, or, you know, and I'm wondering, you know, I realized when you were talking about generations, I can go 7 back in our family, but a lot because of photographs. And I think that too, that visual record is also an important part of this. So I really wanted to thank you, especially for sharing that song and the way that lives on. But also ask you, you know, your take on this. Do you find this tension? Because I can't ever get away from it in a certain way. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you. That's a fantastic question and something I think about a lot. I mean, so we had in the 90s, we did our federal recognition packet. So the Tongva are one of two, California Indians have their own weird, it's a whole weird thing. We have more non-federally recognized tribes, 56 of them, than any other place in the United States. In fact, there's only 2 state-recognized tribes, the Tongva, my tribe, and the Ahashiman, our cousins to the south in Orange County. And when we were doing the federal recognition packet, one of the things you have to do is, of course, you know, have all of these oral histories, and I did a lot of this. My father was membership and certification chair, and I took that position after he went on to the Ancestors. And so, you know, this was a huge tension that we faced internally. You know, there were stories that we didn't want to record, but we had, you know, sometimes we had to, you know, think around that and work on that. But the most critical place I see it is in these songs themselves. Now, I know she recorded that song, and she felt that song was okay to record, but I know there's other songs that she didn't record. And very few of those survived. I do remember my great-grandmother singing a few of them, but there's a whole other tradition. I don't know if you know of the kind of California ghost dance song tradition, and I know the first rule of ghost dance is, I feel weird on anything, even saying, you know, first rule of ghost dance is don't talk about ghost dance. The ghost dance tradition, those songs cannot be recorded. There's like an absolute prescription. They cannot be written down. They cannot be recorded in any way, because precisely what you said, they have to absolutely be internalized. And in fact, they have to even become personal. They have to be sort of like, they have to become yours, sometimes modifying them in certain ways. And there's an absolute tension there. They cannot be. They would lose their power. They would lose their worth. And in fact, you know, there's a community that feels like because they did something against that was, they almost feel it like a curse. You know, I don't want to read too much into that, but the power of that speaks to that family even to this day, you know, really resonates with me. And so, you know, and I am a holder of one of those lines, those song lines. And, you know, it's a constant like worry for me. Whom can I pass it to? Because it has to be passed. But, you know, I have a daughter, and we do have, she can do the basket weaving tradition from my family, but she can't do that. We do have, which, you know, I also want to, which I see problems with, but I also want to respect the kind of cultural heritage there. It becomes so complex. I mean, there is no right answer, right? It's just so complicated. There's always that tension. I want to preserve as much as possible, but then do you lose I think authenticity is not even the right word. It's the internalization of that. There is no right answer, which I think is the point, right? It's always that tension between those two. But thank you for sharing your own stories of that. And it's so interesting, too, that the visual, the pictures, helped keep the lineage that you had together. I see that with our own community as well. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So basically, earlier you were talking about like lineage and the concept of the real Indians.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I'm just like wondering, basically, can you expand on that concept a bit?
Of the real Indian?
Yes, the ethnicity, the real Indian.
Well, and I kind of mentioned that, you know, this becomes such a question with kind of identity, right? Are you a real Indian? How do you determine if you're a real Indian? Is it by blood quantum, which are, you know, totally colonial concepts that are imposed on us? I mean, obviously, you know, you can look at me, I have European ancestry, I have Scandinavian ancestry, Jewish ancestry, Middle Eastern ancestry, a whole host of other ancestries as well. And so, you know, am I not real? You know, and this is a huge theme of the work of so many Native American and Indigenous artists in general, because, you know, all our communities, like so many other, you know, communities affected by colonialism, that's a part of it as well. So, you know, you see it in literary works of almost all Native American authors. I'm not going to mention one, but I'll go to like Tommy Orange, thinking about like, what does it mean to be a real Indian? It's an obsession, right? Are you real enough? And that's why I had that comment about, you know, you always get asked, you know, oh yeah, how Indian are you, right? How Native American are you, right? Which is, you know, this subtle, which is, you know, blood quantum, but in kind of like a social discourse form. And the only answer you can ever give to that, right, is, oh, I'm so Indian. I am just like totally so I am like 200%, because any other answer belittles somebody, right? It's going to belittle either the person who has, you know, less, or it's going to belittle yourself if somebody else has more. And that's why so many, and, you know, dealing with that is so challenging, because, you know, there are, and also, you know, there are people who have lost their connection to their ancestry through no fault of their own. And that is so troubling for so many communities. And then it has led, which I think is, again, a colonial thing, to, you know, the horrors of disenrollment that happen in so many tribal communities. And, you know, my own community, I'm very grateful that it's very inclusive. We have in our tribal constitution that anybody of descent can be a member of our tribal community. But the most helpful doctrine, and I hate to even use that term, is one that I hear again and again. It's not about who you claim, it's about who claims you. And so the most important, I think, way to, what does it mean, to me at least, and this is just me, to be a real Indian is to be useful to your community, to be a part of it, to think in that 7th generational fashion, where you're thinking forward and backward, and making that connection. And I see we're getting the time signal. I hope that at least started to answer that, but it's such a huge question. I'm not sure there is an answer.
I think that's actually a really good point on which to break. So just as a reminder, we have a 2-hour lunch. We will come back at 1:45 for 2 more talks in the afternoon. But before we leave, please join me in thanking Wallace Cleaves one more time for that lovely talk.
Thank you.